All right, to start now, we're joined by author and writer with the Mail on Sunday, Peter Hitchens. Good morning, Peter. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, it's a pleasure.
I suppose, firstly, we don't want to rehash the whole Brexit debate, but just for our listeners...
You'll lose so many listeners if you do that.
But just for our listeners to get a sense of where you're coming from, you have been a long-standing critic of the EU and the UK's place within the EU, but at the same time, you would still have voted to remain in the referendum.
No, I wouldn't. I didn't vote at all. I stood aside from it because referendum fit in your constitution, which has serious provisions for them to make sure that they're fair, and also that they have been part of your constitution, I think, from the start. They really don't fit with ours, and I thought it was a constitutional outrage. Parliament should decide these things, and I'd always felt that the European issue should eventually come up at a general election with two parties on opposite sides so that it could be decided properly. And the mess that we're in now is largely because of taking a foolish shortcut. So no, I wouldn't have voted to remain.
Oh, you
wouldn't? I just steered completely clear of it, and I wouldn't campaign or vote in it. I feel thoroughly vindicated, by the way. It's been such a mess.
I'm sure you do. And in terms of that mess, I suppose this weekend all the focus now is on the Irish question.
As well it might be.
As well it might be. And you identified this actually back in March, that the Irish question was going to be a big, big problem. Yep. You identified the border at that time as a major problem. And yet you may have been one of the few in Britain identifying the border as a major problem, because it doesn't appear to have registered with the British government as a major problem until the last couple of weeks.
Lots of things haven't registered with them. I do try to maintain an interest in our nearest neighbour, because it would seem to me to be very, very foolish not to. And it struck me, and I've crossed that border many times. It's an interesting border, and it struck me that there was a problem here. And there is no easy solution to it in the current arrangements. The only way in which you could overcome it would be by pursuing the aim which several of my fellow anti-EU campaigners have adopted now, which is that the United Kingdom should stay in the single market via the European Economic Area, the so-called Norway option, which would actually get rid of most of this difficulty, because Norway, although not in the customs union, is in the single market and has perfectly good border relations with its EU neighbour Sweden.
Do you think that that's a possibility at all, given Theresa May has already ruled out both the single market and the customs union?
Well, I don't know if it's a possibility. I just hope that it becomes one as people realise, I think mostly they don't, what's going on. The problem that people such as me had during the long period when we argued in vain that Britain should regain its national sovereignty was that most people in British politics and journalism didn't understand the European issue. They didn't know the history of it, they didn't know what it was about, they didn't know how it worked. And I would always recommend them to read Christopher Booker's great book, The Great Deception, and also the left-wing book on the opposite side, Hugo Young's This Blessed Plot, which are essential guides to it. And I find in conversation with people in general in Britain that they're unaware of the existence of these books and of the facts contained in them. So they just don't know what they're talking about. And here we are, this ridiculous position with me, for many years, someone who longed for Britain to leave the European Union, looking on in horror at the mess his own government is making of doing this, because they simply don't understand it. I think that the Irish issue may drive it home to them that they simply can't wing it. That the whole difficulty of becoming, as we would on departing from the European Union, a third country, which would have to have, it seems to me, a hard border with the Irish Republic if it did follow that route, must concentrate their minds and make them understand that there needs to be a new approach. And I still say the Norway option satisfies a great deal of what those of us who want to get out of the European Union want. But it also bears in mind the considerable doubts and worries of the very large minority who don't want to leave. And I think that any serious government has to remember minorities as well as majorities.
And just in terms of what you're saying there about people not understanding how all of this works, is that an explanation then for how the Irish border and the whole question over that has been left to the last minute? Do you think there was just a lack of engagement, a lack of understanding as to exactly the ramifications on the Irish border of Brexit?
I think so. I don't think anybody really knew what they were doing at all. Remember, because this wasn't a general election, the Leave campaign didn't contain anybody who was going to be responsible for implementing it if it won. As soon as the campaign was over, the Leave campaign just dissipated like mist in the wind, and there was nobody there to take responsibility for it. And the government, which was composed mainly of people who never wanted to leave in the first place, were left with the job of doing what the referendum had told them to do. I keep coming back to the absurdity of having a referendum in a fundamentally parliamentary state, but that's what we did, and on an issue of this size as well. So here we have it. And there's Dominic Cummings, who was one of the Leave campaigners on a different occasion, once said, people seem to think that in government there is somewhere, as there always is in the James Bond films, a room where the really intelligent people are who know what to do. And there is no such room. People overestimate both the knowledge, responsibility, and competence of politicians. And here we actually have the British political class floundering, pathetically, quite unable to decide what to do, deeply ignorant of the process that's involved. Many people can't even tell the customs union from the single market, for instance, and confuse them in public conversation. So how can someone who's that dim about how the whole thing works conceivably negotiate an exit from it? I just stand amazed.
Part of what we've seen then as a result of that confusion is a lot of criticism in the UK press of the approach taken by the Irish government and of Leo Varadkar, our new Taoiseach in particular. What do you make of his comments and how he's tackled all this?
I thought he was mistaken in terms of straightforward tact in going to Belfast and making remarks about separate issues a few months ago. But I don't see on this matter how the Irish government can behave any differently. No sane Irish government wants a hard border. Indeed, I don't think anyone in the north wants a hard border either. And if they don't bang the drum and raise the issue as fiercely as possible, then they may well find that they get one by default. I don't criticize the Irish government at all for raising this and for being very serious about it. It would be absurd. What is the point of having an Irish government if it doesn't do that? I know that the Irish government would rather there wasn't a border at all, but that's something that we're stuck with for historic reasons that no one can easily overcome, and there is, for the moment, a border. Though I do think that one of the things that this raises is the question of how much longer Northern Ireland can remain under British sovereignty, and how long it will be before somebody triggers the referendum on that issue promised in the 1998 Belfast Agreement. And what would happen if it did, especially if we get a hard border and it all goes wrong. Yeah, I think this raises so many complicated long-term issues. But no, it's perfectly reasonable for the Irish government to raise it and push it and make it an issue. The European Union has given the Irish government, in some ways, a disproportionate amount of influence over its affairs for reasons which, again, are fairly obvious to anybody. And why not take advantage of it while you've got it?
All right, and I do want to get back to your thoughts on the United Ireland being only a matter of time, or at least a referendum on that being only a matter of time. But in the shorter term, the negotiations this weekend and over the next 2 weeks being on whether or not there can be any regulatory divergence between the two jurisdictions. And obviously,
I don't see how you can do it. I mean, there may be some secret not revealed to anybody yet about how a third country can have relations with the European Union which are not those of a third country. But as I understand, as soon as we leave, we become a third country, and the whole process by which the existing border between our two countries is free and easy comes to an end, and all kinds of new, very complicated arrangements have to be negotiated, and large numbers of officials have to be hired to enforce them, and the border, because it will then separate two entirely different legal jurisdictions, will have to be enforced. I don't see any way around it.
Well, even the single market idea that you proposed there a little earlier in the conversation, that has problems with it too, though, doesn't it, Peter, in terms of there being border checks and things like that?
There are problems, but as I say, I think that the Norwegians and the Swedes have managed to make it run pretty smoothly. It's not the devastating thing which would result from us abruptly leaving the single market.
All right, but there would still be border checks of some sort.
There are difficulties that can be overcome, and difficulties that are so huge that it's hard to see how they can be overcome. And I think that's the difference between the two.
In terms of what is most likely to happen then, a lot of the reports over the last couple of days suggesting the British government is moving towards something along the lines of what the Irish government is looking for, which would put the border in the Irish Sea. Now, the DUP obviously very unhappy about that. Do you think that when it comes down to it, the Unionists are going to be sacrificed on the altar of Brexit?
Well, the British government has been longing to sacrifice the Unionists for nearly a century now, and would love to do so, but it can't very easily do that. It took one major step towards sacrificing the Unionists in the 1998 agreement, I thought, which seemed to me to be a long-term decision by the British government, effectively to say to the six counties, time to go. A very heavy hint, but I think at the moment, with a weak and divided government dependent for its majority on the Democratic Unionists, I really can't see how they could possibly agree to placing any kind of customs border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. I just don't see how they could do it. I've seen miracles happen in politics, but generally they've been things collapsing rather than people trying to build new barriers.
Because Theresa May's government will collapse, but if she doesn't do it, then Ireland is forced to use the veto, or the EU says, sorry, we can't go any further.
Well, yes, but vetoes are dangerous things to use, aren't they? They're much better waved around and threatened than actually used. It's an ultimate deterrent. As I say, I'm still hoping that there will be a general coming to the senses when people do begin to be educated on this. The question is who is going to educate them, and it might actually fall to the Irish government to educate British politicians in just what a major step it is they're preparing to take, because I still don't think
they're not taking too kindly to that, though, are they, the British politicians, in being educated by the Irish government on any of this?
People don't. Proper education is a tough process, which often involves a good deal more listening than talking. And maybe this is the occasion. As I say, my hope is that in general the British political class will be sternly and strictly educated and made to do their homework on the real nature of the European Union and the actual practical possibilities of leaving it without doing grave collateral damage. And if the Irish government concentrates the mind of British politicians to the extent that they finally understand that here is something intractable unless they shift, that might be a good thing. I live in hope.
Just in the longer term then, Peter, you think a united Ireland, or at least a referendum on that, is only a matter of time?
Well, I've always thought so. I'm not necessarily in favour of it. I think there is a very big problem with the unionist minority in the north of Ireland, and I think that the Irish state would have a great deal of difficulty in absorbing it, even if a referendum voted for a transfer of sovereignty. But I do think that it was always the intention of the 1998 agreement that there should be a move towards that referendum, and there is no doubt that if such a referendum took place, it would be implemented. The British government, in signing that agreement, committed itself to implementing the result of it, and that maybe raises other problems. I just think that this is another likely side effect of this problem, that the question of holding that referendum will become a live one. It's really been in abeyance for some years, and hardly anyone's raised it. Sinn Féin, I think, felt that the time wasn't ripe, especially after Ireland's own economic crisis. But on the other hand, if this causes a major political and economic mess, there it is, waiting for someone to activate it.
All right, Peter Hitchens, author and writer with The Mail on Sunday, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.